Okay, now we'll move into the relationship between smoking and mental health, unless there's any questions at this point. Okay. So why do individuals with mental illness smoke? I always get asked this question. What comes first, chicken or the egg? What's this relationship here? There's a number of studies showing that smoking in adolescence is associated with psychiatric disorders in adulthood, including panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, depression and suicidal behavior, substance use disorders, and schizophrenia. Really interesting study that was done in Israel with the youth who have to enroll into the service, following them over time, knowing that they were a smoker was a significant predictor of developing schizophrenia in adulthood. So that's one study there. There is a fair amount of literature that is getting close to saying that smoking could cause panic disorder and seeing more of a mechanism there as well. But there's also literature to show that having mental illness is associated with daily smoking and also progression to nicotine dependence. Literature going both ways. And I just don't think we're at a point where we can say it's a causative relationship either way, and I think it's too simplistic to say that it's a gene that does it or it's the environment that does it. And instead, I think it's real impact of a number of different factors that play out. Some of them specific to those with mental illness, some of it just general to smoking and its impact. So some literature showing that there's a genetic predisposition between tobacco use and other substance use, tobacco use and depression risk, alleviation of withdrawal. Nicotine is a very powerful drug. Estimates that it's harder to quit than any other drug. People who have been on heroin said it's harder to quit smoking than it is to quit heroin. You've got the pleasure effects. That's true whether you're an individual with mental illness or not. Weight control effects, true if you're a smoker with mental illness or not. And then psychological, biological, this conditioning effect. No other drug is dosed as frequently as nicotine is with a cigarette. So a smoker takes about 10 puffs per cigarette. There's 20 cigarettes in a pack. That's 200 puffs per pack. If you smoke a pack a day, 1,400 puffs per week. And they're dosing that nicotine with everything that they do. They get up in the morning, they have their cigarette. They're on the phone, they have the cigarette with coffee, in the car, stressed out, at night. And it just, having that pairing, it's that best friend that's been there constantly for major periods of their lives. And so typically you will have the cessation medication on effect to address the biological, the withdrawal effects, so that you can get in there with behavioral treatments to start shaping their environment in different ways, offering other coping tools so that they can retrain their minds to live a smoke-free life. Coping tool, yes, absolutely. Most smokers start before the age of 18. Okay? That's that strategy that they now have, and they'll use it with stressed, depressed, anxious, and it's been there for them. And so they may not have had to develop other coping strategies because they've always turned to tobacco. I do teaching in our medical school at UCSF and was co-teaching with a pulmonologist, really bright man, later went on to Genentech. And he shared with the students, he goes, the reason I quit smoking is because I realized I didn't have any other coping strategies. It was just what I always turned to. And so I challenged myself, I need healthier ways to deal with stress. I need healthier ways to deal with anxiety. Now he's an MD and he's got a lot of resources, and so the patients that you're working with, may not be able to do this on their own, and are going to need your help and support in developing other coping strategies. And this is the work that you do. I mean, your stress management skills and depression management skills, and finding strategies that are not going to cause cancer, heart disease, and can really help the patients that you're working with. And then boredom. Certainly, if you're bored, that cigarette is a stimulant and, it activates the patient. So finding other ways of pleasant activities for helping your patients instead of smoking. And social interactions, it can often be a prompt or, a prop rather for, dealing with nervous anxieties around social interactions. And so helping your patients become more relaxed, doing some role plays, forming bonds with individuals who are non-smokers, reaching out to the quit line for support with quitting. This last part here, systemic and treatment factors, this is an issue that I've gotten really passionate about, I've published in, because it was for a long time just really ignored, this differential treatment of those with co-occurring disorders. And we'll talk about some of the systemic and treatment factors there, both use of cigarettes for reinforcement as well as failure to treat. Okay, so what's the neurochemistry, the effects of nicotine? Nicotine in the brain acts on dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, glutamate, beta-endorphin, GABA, and serotonin. And its effects include pleasure and reward, with norepinephrine, arousal, appetite suppression, cognitive enhancement, learning, memory enhancement, reduction of anxiety and tension, mood modulation, appetite suppression. So when you hear a smoker say, well, I get up in the morning and I smoke because it gets me going, gets me pepped up and energized, and yet I smoke at night because it helps me relax and to calm down, or I smoke so that I can focus or that I can do my work, or I smoke so that I don't have hunger and I can control my appetite. And you're wondering, how can this drug do all of this? And this is how it does, because it acts so pervasively on all these different neurochemicals in the brain. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great hypothesis. I haven't seen that. I mean, you see very high rates of smoking, atypicals or typicals, and when they've tried to use like SSRIs, and if you give SSRIs, will that help them with quitting smoking? It's not shown to help with quitting smoking. Mm-hmm. 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 No, not that I've seen. That's a great hypothesis. And just to repeat it for the satellite group, so Marty's asking, could it be that with the medications that we're putting on these patients that are blocking a number of these neurochemicals, are they then smoking so that they break through that to get the pleasure and reward that the medications are blocking? Yep. That's interesting. Thank you. Nicotine acts on the dopamine reward pathway in the brain, just like other drugs of abuse, like heroin or cocaine. Enters the brain, stimulates nicotinic receptors in the ventral tegmental area, which releases dopamine into the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. So very similar in its activity to other drugs of abuse. And what we see that's a little unusual is that in human smokers, you actually have increased nicotine receptors in the prefrontal cortex rather than decreased. So you've got more of these nicotinic receptors. So that's where you get some of the withdrawal as the nicotine gets pulled away. This slide I really love. This is by Neil Benowitz's work. This is done in the lab with smokers. This is an individual who's smoking every 40 minutes throughout the course of a day. The bottom area, the clear area, this shows abstinence symptoms. This is when the individual would be feeling a state of withdrawal, irritable, anxious. The shaded part is a neutral zone where they're just feeling like a non-smoker. And then the white area on the top would be pleasure or arousal zone where they're feeling that high from the nicotine. And when a smoker gets up in the morning, if they've not smoked at night, and some of our patients do smoke at night, but if they haven't, then their brain is free of nicotine. They have that first cigarette in the morning and they shoot up into the pleasure or arousal zone. And that's where you'll hear a smoker say, oh, that first cigarette in the morning, I just could never get rid of it because that's the most important one to me. And it's because that's where they're getting that greatest surge of pleasure and arousal from the cigarette. But as the smoker goes throughout the course of a day, what you see is that they're not so much smoking to get pleasure and arousal as they are to avoid the abstinence withdrawal symptoms. Okay, so they're titrating through the day just to feel normal. Okay. And it's educating your patients that once they can get free from the nicotine, that over time they won't go through this roller coaster of state throughout the day. They'll just have a normal, feeling like a non-smoker. And you actually hear non-smokers saying, in studies that have been done, non-smokers have less stress, former smokers less stress than current smokers. Other thing to mention here is that when I've done consultation for psychiatric settings, that's inpatient psych settings that still allow smoking, and they say, well, we can't rob them of their cigarettes because that would be inhumane. So instead, we let them go out and they smoke every 4 hours, and our staff takes them out and they go out and they smoke and then they come back in. What's going to happen if they're allowed to only smoke every 4 hours rather than dosing it every 40 minutes? Okay, even more highs and lows in terms of their, feeling a high from the cigarette and then lows of withdrawal. And that's where you get, it's approaching hour 2, 3, and the patients are like, when can we go out and smoke? When can we go out and smoke? And the staff are saying, my goodness, we could never take away their cigarettes. Look how agitated they get. And it's because they've got these highs and lows. Put on a nicotine patch, provide gum and lozenge, and you'll be managing the withdrawal in a much more humane way than you would be with allowing them to smoke like that. What's the withdrawal effects? Dysphoric or depressed mood, insomnia, fatigue, irritability, frustration, anger, anxiety or nervousness, difficulty concentrating, impaired task performance, increased appetite, weight gain, restlessness and impatience, as well as craving for cigarettes. So all of these highs that you get with the nicotine, you take the nicotine away, and that's where you get that withdrawal syndrome. Now, what happens in psychiatry, and this is what I found when I was interning on the inpatient psych unit where they weren't allowed to smoke, these symptoms, depression, difficulty sleeping, irritability, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, impaired task performance, restlessness, impatience, those symptoms map onto, depressive disorder, anxiety disorders. And so it's not surprising that in mental health we often confuse nicotine withdrawal with other disorders. Okay, oh, they're agitated and anxious, give them a benzodiazepine because that's how we need to medicate their anxiety. Oh, their mood is really depressed, let's give them an antidepressant. But most, benzos don't treat nicotine withdrawal. Most antidepressants don't treat nicotine withdrawal. So it's really important to have a sense of what's causing this and to use the right medication. With your patients, educate them that the first 2 to 4 days are the worst in terms of dealing with withdrawal, and that symptoms will subside over 2 to 4 weeks. And there's a nice handout in your packet. Oh, and I did have this one too. There's a nice handout in your packet about the withdrawal symptoms, and it goes through what is the symptom, for example, chest tightness, what's the cause, it educates your patient on what the cause is. Tightness is likely due to tension created by the body's need for nicotine, may be caused by sore muscles from coughing. How long is it expected to last? A few days. What can you do for relief? Both pharmacotherapy as well as behavioral. So use relaxation techniques, try deep breathing, use of nicotine replacement might help. And then the other sheet I'll just point out to you too, drug interactions with tobacco smoke, goes through the different psychiatric medications and then the mechanism of interaction and how much of an effect is seen from the tobacco smoke. The genetic effects on nicotine metabolism, I'll just briefly point this out. 80% of nicotine is broken down into cotinine. In research, we actually measure cotinine in blood or saliva or urine because it stays around in the body longer than nicotine, so we can have a biomarker of exposure. And there's research that's been shown that the rate at which nicotine is metabolized through the body can vary substantially for individuals. So you have fast metabolizers and slow metabolizers. And the fast metabolizers tend to be heavier smokers, tend to be more nicotine dependent. And the fast metabolizers, they may need more nicotine replacement when they're going to quit. So, one patch may not be enough for a fast metabolizer because their body is just churning through that nicotine and they're back into a state of withdrawal. So it's just something to be aware of. What is addiction? Addiction is compulsive drug use without medical purpose in the face of negative consequences. And certainly smoking, nicotine addiction fits that definition. This is Koob's work, and I like it because it maps on nicely to kind of an OCD model, which I think is relevant for the work. This model of addiction, initially when an individual starts to smoke, it's more of an impulse control disorder. They do an impulsive act to smoke that gives them some pleasure, relief, gratification. They then may feel regret, some guilt, some self-reproach, which creates tension, which then leads to another impulsive act to smoke. And this initial part of the timeline of smoking is more around positive reinforcement. So starting the behavior because they're getting that high from the nicotine, that enjoyment of the act of smoking. But over time, the reason that they're smoking is not so much for positive reinforcement, but for negative reinforcement, to remove the withdrawal symptoms from not smoking. And it becomes much more of a compulsive disorder, this repetitive behavior where they're seeking out that cigarette, which gives, again, relief of anxiety, relief of stress, which then leads to obsessions about when am I going to have that next cigarette, which creates anxiety and stress, which then leads to the repetitive behavior of smoking. And you can talk with your patients, well, how did it start out when you're smoking? Well, initially I just liked it. It was fun thing to do with my friends. I was in control of it. I could just smoke when I wanted to. Okay, and what is it like for you now? Well, now I feel completely out of control. The cigarette's controlling me, and I smoke because I have to have it. I need to have it. And talking with them about how that's changed for them and how they'd like to get back their freedom. Tobacco is relevant for mental health because it's actually a psychiatric diagnosable disorder. So nicotine dependence and nicotine withdrawal are both Axis I diagnosable disorders. It doesn't need to be the first one on your list of diagnoses, but having it there in your list of Axis I disorders will raise the awareness to the treating providers. Any referrals you might be making help to get it on the treatment plan. And with the revision of DSM-5, I believe it'll just be one disorder, one nicotine disorder. But the criteria for nicotine dependence, very similar to other drugs of abuse, at least 3 of these criteria in the 12-month period: tolerance, withdrawal, increased use, unsuccessful efforts to stop, time investment, so they're spending a lot of time in the day smoking their cigarettes or looking for cigarettes or buying cigarettes, loss of important activities. Maybe they decide not to go to the movies or not to go see a family member or a friend because they're a non-smoker, not spend time with their grandkids because they're a smoker, and continued use despite knowledge of physical or psychological problems. So often seen that in the participants that we work with, high rates of bronchitis, emphysema, heart disease, and yet still continuing to use tobacco. Most smokers who you'll work with will meet criteria for nicotine dependence. And then nicotine withdrawal, daily use of nicotine, when they stop smoking, whether it's from a hospitalization or because they're trying to quit, you see within 24 hours at least 4 of these symptoms. So the depressed mood, insomnia, irritability, anxiety, difficulty concentrating. You actually see decreased heart rate. That's just a physiological thing that the individual probably won't notice, and increased appetite. And it can cause that it causes clinically significant impairment that's not due to a general medical condition. Okay, what about the systemic treatment factors? So those are more the biological factors that lead to nicotine addiction. And those are true, the impact of the neurochemicals in the brain, that's true whether you're an individual with mental health concerns or not. This next piece is really specific to those with co-occurring disorders. And I got interested in this area. I got interested actually because I was interning in an inpatient psych unit, and I saw the patients that I was working with who were smokers, who wanted to leave the hospital to go smoke, who weren't getting the care that they needed, and yet still weren't being advised to quit by the mental health providers, weren't getting treatment, nicotine replacement therapy. And so I wanted to get a sense of, well, how did we come to this place? What's been the history of smoking in the mental health field? And there's a book that's in our library at UCSF, and it's written by a former professor at UC, and it's from 1951, so it's fairly dated. And there's a chapter that's called Behavior During the Interview, with the question, should the therapist smoke during the interview? And the response, why not? It will help drain the small amount of undischarged tension, which is always present during an interview, and it contributes to the naturalness of his behavior. And it is just very much part of the culture, whether it was individual treatment, whether it was group treatment. We've got videos of people on family treatment, historical videos trying to show how to do family therapy, and the therapist right there smoking along with the patients. Very just much part of the culture, part of the bonding, the development of rapport, trust, and you just wouldn't find this. You wouldn't go see your OB and have them smoking with you, or your cardiologist, or your pediatrician. So, why does it happen with mental health providers? And it's still, maybe this sounds like it's such a thing of the past, and yet I still hear about, particularly addiction treatment facilities, some mental health facilities, of staff still smoking with the patients, and what kind of message is that giving in this day and age? So that was 51. This is going forward to 1980. Again, this is 16 years after the Surgeon General's first report on the negative health effects of tobacco. So by then, society knew that tobacco was bad. And this is a document that I obtained through the Legacy documents. It's an online library that UCSF has created, and it's about 70 million pages of previously secret industry documents, so previously secret tobacco industry documents. These were in the files of the tobacco industry, and they were obtained through litigation with the Master Settlement Agreement. So this letter, it was to R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at NIMH in D.C. And it was a letter requesting a donation of cigarettes for long-term psychiatric patients, that because of recent changes in our regulations, St. Elizabeth Hospital can no longer purchase cigarettes for them. So can you please send us 5,000 cigarettes a week for our patients? And this was written by the medical director, who is a prominent schizophrenia researcher. And it's not to say that this person is bad, it's just that it's so predominant, so pervasive in the mindset that tobacco is just part of psychiatry. And of course, of course we would provide cigarettes for our patients. They're here and we're helping them. And this is just one letter. There's plenty of letters, and I found them as late as 2000, which is kind of where the documents max out, but from a hospital in Hawaii requesting cigarettes as well. Secondhand smoke, for most of us, we can live our day without being exposed to secondhand smoke. We can go to restaurants, bars, workplace, here even laundromats, and not be around cigarettes. The one exception, and this is the number of bills that were being put forward in the legislation in Maine, all of these are acts to restrict smoking, except for this one, which is an act to exempt substance abuse and psychiatric patients from the prohibition against smoking in hospitals. So if we wonder, well, why do these patients smoke at such high rates? Why are they the only ones? Well, they're the only group where we really enabled them to smoke, provided them with cigarettes as treatment providers, allowed them to be in locked facilities where there's a lot of boredom, where cigarettes are provided. And lo and behold, smoking at high rates. There's also this belief of self-medication, okay? Well, if it's self-medication, maybe our patients need to smoke because they're medicating their symptoms in some way, and it'd be inhumane from us to take away that medication from them. In fact, one of the letters, I think the one from Hawaii, said that, classified that tobacco's one of the most effective forms of medication that psychiatrists had found for their patients. So even some language of the psychiatrists using that term with tobacco. Okay, so in the documents you can find, again, correspondence with the tobacco industry. This was a research proposal to the industry, and the title was Tobacco Smoking as a Coping Mechanism in Psychiatric Disorders, Psychiatric Patients, Psychological, Behavioral, and Physiological Investigations. The investigator promised to bear fruitful findings. I say that if I can promise to bear you fruitful findings, you don't need to fund me. We already know what the result's going to be. But further, it is particularly interesting that the psychiatrists, who are the medical professionals, are very aware of the role of tobacco use in patients, are very interested in these studies. If tobacco can be shown to be an efficient form of self-medication for these patients, then this would be a significant bonus for the tobacco industry. And this individual was from Canada. The tobacco industry would like to fund foreign investigators to reduce the likelihood of things being found through litigation. This individual had been sponsored by the tobacco industry for some years. So this is RJR. Up to last year, his own salary was paid by us, so he was totally dependent on our funding. And this latest report, once again, he seems to be looking at this from our point of view. And they did decide to fund him. It's interesting, the proposal he sent them just prior was to look at tobacco in children. And they decided, ooh, that was a little too sensitive. We can't really fund that. But tobacco in psych patients, oh yeah, we can fund that. If you can show it's self-medication, that'll be a bonus for us. That'll be helpful for us. And they did fund him. And yet when you go to search the published literature, I can't find anything that resulted from this study. So he was funded. I found the check online, and yet no indication that he found those promised fruitful findings, because he certainly didn't publish them. And then this is another document in the tobacco industry library, where showing that they were marketing to individuals with schizophrenia. This is a mirror image of Merit cigarettes, and it says other low tars are pretty one-dimensional, dull, but the new Merit is a whole other story. Big new taste with lower tar, and that's exciting. And it goes on, for a new Merit, having two sides is just normal behavior. Okay. So what do we see in terms of addressing tobacco in practice? This is some data. It's from the early 1990s. And they did a review of the National Ambulatory Medical Care Survey. So these are psychiatrists in practice, in outpatient practice. Nearly a quarter of the visits had to be dropped because the psychiatrist didn't know if the patient was a smoker. Okay, so even just asking about tobacco use and documenting it hadn't happened. For patients who were identified as smokers, cessation counseling was offered at only 12% of the visits. Nicotine dependence was not diagnosed at any visit, and nicotine replacement, which was under prescription at that time, was never prescribed. We've done work with psychiatrists in training, figuring, okay, well, this is the future, maybe they're doing better. Hearing that 58% are often or always asking about smoking, fewer advising cessation, 17% assessing readiness to quit, 18% assisting with quitting, 13% arranging follow-up. So really, really low rates. And if, with you being on the front line, I just really appreciate that the psychiatrist may not address tobacco. So it's really, you're that first level working with these patients, so critical, and also often able to refer them to the ASH line or to provide treatment within your realm, which would be great. So that that was some data that was early 1990s. This was a survey that was done in 2006 that I mentioned earlier, over 800 psychiatrists. Higher rates of asking about tobacco, 62%, 44% assessing readiness to quit, 62% advising cessation. But again, assistance being really pretty low, less than a quarter receiving assistance, only 14% arranging follow-up, only 11% referring to others. And it can take less than a minute to refer to the quit line. And as I mentioned, psychiatrists were the least likely to address tobacco use with their patients relative to other specialties. So to summarize tobacco products, they're effective delivery systems for the highly addictive drug nicotine. Nicotine activates the dopamine reward pathway in the brain, which reinforces continued tobacco use. Nicotine dependence and withdrawal are DSM-4 psychiatric disorders. And tobacco dependence involves biological, psychological, and social factors requiring a long-term, multifaceted treatment approach.